The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Clara Voss found him. She had gone out before first light to check the fence line along the south pasture, the one the flash flooding always chewed through, and she nearly stepped on him in the dark. He was face down in the red mud beside the dry creek bed, the kind of mud that grabs at your boots and doesn't let go easy, and for a half-breath she thought he was already dead. Thought he was just another thing the desert had finished with and discarded. Then he moved. It was barely anything. A tremor in the fingers. A shallow hitch of breath that rattled wet and wrong in his chest. But Clara Voss had been watching for the smallest signs of life for 11 years on this hard-scrabble piece of Arizona territory. And she recognized that particular stubbornness, that refusal to go quietly, because she had practiced it herself in her own worst moments. She set her lantern in the mud and knelt beside him. He was Apache. She could see that plainly enough in the lines of his face, the copper of his skin gone grey and waxy beneath the rain. He had been shot twice, once through the left shoulder, once low along his right side, and whoever had done it had left him to finish the dying on his own. There was a gash along his temple that had clotted black with dirt and blood, and his lips were cracked and split despite the rain pouring down on him. He was young. Younger than she'd expected. Maybe 25. Maybe less. Clara looked back at the house. Looked at the dark windows and the quiet yard and the 2 horses standing miserable and patient in the pen. Then she looked back at the man bleeding into the Arizona mud. She got her arms under his and she pulled. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. Getting him inside took everything she had. Clara was not a small woman, 11 years of hauling water, splitting wood. And working cattle alone had built her into something lean and capable, but the warrior was broad through the shoulders and dense with muscle, and half-dead weight is the worst kind to move. She dragged him across the yard in the rain, his heels cutting twin furrows in the mud. And she got him up the porch steps by sitting him against the rail and lifting one limb at a time like she was moving fence posts. She got him through the door. She got him onto the kitchen floor where the pine boards were at least dry and flat. She lit the lamps and got her first true look at him. The shoulder wound was the cleaner of the 2, the bullet had gone through, which was a mercy. The side wound was older and had already begun to fester, the skin puckered and hot to the touch. The flesh around it swollen with the particular angry redness that meant infection had taken hold and was spreading its roots. The gash at his temple was long but shallow. Head wounds bled dramatic but killed slow, mostly. It was the side she worried about. She built the fire up and put water on to boil. Her medical knowledge was not the kind that came from books or from schooling. It was the kind that came from necessity, from a husband who'd taken an arrow in the thigh during their 3rd year out here and lived because she'd learned fast and wasn't squeamish. From a neighbor woman 20 miles off who'd taught her to pack wounds with honey and yarrow poultice, from years of watching what worked and what didn't on animals and on men. She had a tin box under the bed with clean linen strips, a bone-handled knife she kept sharp, a bottle of carbolic solution traded off a passing doctor 2 winters back. And the yarrow she dried herself every fall and kept in paper packets on the top shelf beside the salt. She worked through what remained of the night. She cut away his shirt, what was left of it, which was not much, and washed the wounds with the carbolic, which made him jerk and tighten even in his half-consciousness. His jaw clenching hard against the pain. She irrigated the side wound as best she could, pressed out the corruption, and packed it with the yarrow poultice while it was still warm. She wrapped it tight with the linen strips. She cleaned the gash at his temple with a gentleness she hadn't shown to anything in a long while, and she stitched it closed with 8 small stitches using a curved needle and waxed thread. By the time the sky outside began to go from black to that deep bruised purple of early desert morning, she had him wrapped and propped and breathing easier on a pallet she'd made from her own spare quilt and the horse blanket off the hook by the door. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He had not opened his eyes. But the color in his face had shifted slightly, less gray, less gone. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm that had found some small steadiness. Clara got up and put the kettle back on. Not because she particularly wanted coffee, but because the routine of it steadied her hands, which had begun to shake now that the work was done and there was nothing left to focus on but the strangeness of what she'd done. She had brought an Apache warrior into her home. She turned that fact over in her mind the way you'd turn a stone, looking at all its faces, testing its weight. The territory was not a place that tolerated complications lightly. Her nearest neighbor was the Dillard place, 7 miles north, and old Harlan Dillard was the kind of man who kept opinions like loaded weapons, always pointed at something, always ready to fire. The town of Cobra Wells was 14 miles east, and the men who ran it like a private property, with rules that were never quite written down but were enforced all the same. She poured her coffee and drank it standing at the window, watching the rain thin out and the sky begin to lighten over the jagged black teeth of the Dragoon Mountains. She did not go to bed. Instead, she made oatmeal, thick, with a good measure of dried apple she'd kept back from last fall's trade, and a pour of sorghum that made the whole kitchen smell briefly sweet and ordinary. When it was done, she set a bowl of it on the floor beside the pallet with a tin cup of water and went about her morning chores, the feeding, the milking of the one remaining goat, the checking of the fence she'd initially gone out to inspect. When she came back inside an hour later, the bowl was empty. The cup was empty. The warrior's eyes were open, and they were watching the door. They were dark eyes, very steady, with the particular quality of alertness that belongs to men who have learned that the moment you stop watching is the moment something kills you. He had pushed himself up against the wall, and she could see what the effort had cost him in the tightness around his mouth. They regarded each other across the kitchen in the pale morning light. "I'm not going to hurt you," Clara said. Which was, she supposed, an obvious thing to say to a man lying wounded on your floor, but she said it plain and looked directly at him when she said it. Because tone carried more than words in situations like this. He said nothing. She got the kettle and poured more water into a clean cup and set it within his reach. She moved slowly. Deliberately. The way you'd move around a horse that was scared and had cause to be. "More oatmeal?" she asked. A long silence. Then, "Barely, yes." His voice was rough as creek gravel, low and careful, and the English was accented but clear. Clara nodded once, as though this were entirely normal, and went back to the stove. His name, she learned over 3 days of slow and careful exchange, was Naish. Not a chief's name, he told her once, not looking at her when he said it, looking instead at the middle distance out the window, but an honest name. A name given by his mother, who was 3 years dead of fever, and he said this without particular self-pity, just as fact. The way you'd state the height of a mountain or the distance between two towns. He healed with a speed that impressed her. By the second morning he was sitting up without the wall support. By the third he was standing, carefully, one hand on the table's edge. On the fourth morning she came in from the barn to find him at the window, standing straight, watching the yard with those steady dark eyes. And she could see that his weight was distributed properly and his breathing was clean and unlabored, and the fever that had racked him through the first night had broken and not returned. "You shouldn't be standing that long yet," she said. "I have been still long enough," he said. She could not really argue with that. She understood it too well. That day, because she needed the help and because it seemed he needed to be useful almost as much as he needed to breathe. She let him sit on the porch and work on the harness that had needed mending for 2 months, a long piece of leather stitching she'd kept putting off because her eyesight wasn't what it was in lamplight, and it needed doing in daylight, and daylight kept filling up with other things. She brought him the tools and the leather and the heavy needle and thread. And he took them without comment and worked with a focused economy of motion that made her feel vaguely ashamed of how long the harness had been sitting neglected. He worked for 2 hours without stopping. She watched from the kitchen window while she made bread, working the dough with the heels of her hands, pushing and folding. The rhythm of it familiar enough that she could do it without thinking and think about other things entirely. She thought about what people would say. She thought about Harlan Dillard and his opinions. She thought about Sheriff Cord Beaumont in Cobra Wells, who was not a bad man exactly but was a man made entirely of what other people expected of him. And who would not do well with complications either? 40 miles northwest, in the scrub and rock country where the land began its long wrinkled climb toward the mountains. A man named Harlan Dillard sat on the porch of his ranch house and listened to what his hired man, a thin, wiry creature named Paul, was telling him. Paul had been to Cobra Wells for supplies. Paul had stopped at the Broken Spur Saloon, as Paul always did, and Paul had heard things, as Paul always did. And now Paul was relaying those things with the careful attention to detail that Dillard paid him to maintain. They say she brought one in off the flats, Paul said. Apache buck. Shot up bad, left for dead out by her south fence. She dragged him in the house. Dillard was quiet for a moment. He was a large man, gone soft in the middle but still heavy in the shoulders, with a face that had been burned and creased by the territory sun into something that resembled the landscape around him. He had wanted Clara Voss's land for 4 years. Not badly enough to do anything dramatic about it, not yet, but consistently enough that the wanting had become a kind of permanent background noise in his thinking, like the wind. She still got him in there? Dillard asked. Far as I know. Dillard picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. That land runs right up against the creek draw, he said, not to Paul particularly, just thinking aloud. Apache trouble would clear her out fast enough. Paul said nothing to this. He had learned when to be silent. Might be worth riding out that way, Dillard said. Check on the widow. Being neighborly. He smiled when he said it. The smile did not reach his eyes, which were pale and flat as old nickels. She had to go into Cobra Wells on the 6th day after she'd found Naish. Because she was running short on salt and carbolic and needed 4 bolts to replace the ones that had worked loose on the wagon's rear axle. She left Naish with the rifle and with a direct instruction that he should stay inside unless there was cause not to. And he received this instruction with a dignity that suggested he was neither offended by it nor ignorant of why she gave it. The drive into town was 14 miles of rough track through country that was trying its level best to be beautiful and mostly failing, scrub oak and saguaro and the red rock outcroppings that glowed. The color of old brick in the afternoon light. The sky above so blue it looked painted. Clara drove her wagon at a good clip and kept her own counsel. Cobra Wells was not a large town. It had aspirations toward being larger, which showed in the false front of the buildings along the main street and in the new bank that had gone up 2 years ago with a proper stone facade. It had a general store run by a man named Emmett Crouch and his wife Dorothea, a saloon called the Broken Spur, a sheriff's office, a church of the plain unadorned variety, and a scattering of houses along the side streets where the more permanently settled citizens lived and minded everyone else's business with dedicated thoroughness. Clara tied the wagon in front of Crouch's store and went in and laid her list on the counter. Dorothea Crouch was behind the counter. She was a handsome woman in her 40s with a mouth shaped for opinions and the lung capacity to deliver them at length. She looked at the list and then she looked at Clara with an expression that had judgment in it but hadn't quite decided how to arrange itself yet. "How are things out at your place?" Dorothea asked, reaching for the salt barrel. "Dry when it isn't wet," Clara said. "Same as always." Dorothea filled a paper sack. "Harlan Dillard was in here day before yesterday. He mentioned he'd heard some talk." "Harlan Dillard generates more talk than any 3 women I know," Clara said. "That's always struck me as ironic." Dorothea set the salt on the counter with a small, precise thump. "He said you had an Apache man staying at your place." Clara met her eyes. "I had an injured man that needed medical attention. I provided it." "An Apache man." "An injured man," Clara repeated, and her voice was perfectly level and her eyes did not move. And something in that particular combination of calm and steadiness made Dorothea blink. The bell above the door opened. It was Sheriff Cord Beaumont, and the way he came in, already looking toward Clara, made it clear that his arrival was not accidental. Beaumont was a tall man with a long jaw and careful movements. The kind of lawman who didn't rush toward trouble or away from it but moved at his own steady pace and let the pace itself communicate authority. He had a decent reputation, mostly deserved. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Glad I caught you. Wondered if we might have a word." "We're having one," Clara said. He came to the counter. He took off his hat, she gave him credit for that, and he held it in both hands and looked at her with the expression of a man who is about to say something he expects to be unpopular but believes needs saying regardless. "I've had some folks come to me expressing concern," he started. "About my property and my business," Clara said. "About a potential situation. Apache tensions have been running high since the trouble up in the Tonto Basin, and folks are nervous, and when they're nervous they make poor decisions. I'm trying to get ahead of any poor decisions by asking me to put a wounded man out on the road." Beaumont's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm asking what your intentions are, is all." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window at the dusty street and the people moving along it, the banker's wife with her shopping basket, two cowboys from the rocking case spread leaning against the saddle shop's wall. A boy chasing a dog with the wholehearted attention only boys and dogs can give a thing. "My intentions," she said, "are the same as they always are. To work my land, keep my fences sound, and mind my own affairs. I would recommend it to everyone within earshot." She turned back to Dorothea. "I'll need the carbolic and the bolts as well." "For bolts, 1/2 inch." Dorothea got them without further comment. But across the store, a man Clara recognized as Roy Pratt, foreman of the Dillard operation, had been standing by the dry goods shelf for the last several minutes doing a poor job of pretending to examine calico fabric. And she saw him slip out the door while Beaumont was still watching her, and she noted it, and filed it away. Outside, loading her wagon, Beaumont appeared beside her. "He leave yet?" the sheriff asked quietly. "When he's well enough to travel." A pause. "Mrs. Voss." "Clara." He only used first names in the absence of other ears. "Dillard's been talking to the county land office. About your deed. He's claiming there's some irregularity in the filing your husband did." Clara went still. Then she picked up the salt sack and set it in the wagon bed. Picked up the carbolic. Set it in. "Is there?" she asked. "I don't know. But he's got himself a lawyer from Tucson making inquiries." She tied the wagon cover down and climbed to the seat and gathered the reins. "Thank you for telling me that, Cord," she said. And she meant it, and he could hear that she meant it, and he nodded. She drove out of Cobra Wells with her spine straight and her face set and the particular cold clarity in her chest that comes not from the absence of fear but from having fear and deciding it doesn't. Get a vote. Naish had fixed the window latch. It was a small thing, the latch on the east window of the kitchen had been loose for months, rattling in any wind above a whisper. And she'd propped it shut with a folded piece of leather as a temporary measure that had become permanent in the way temporary measures always did. She came home from Cobra Wells to find it repaired, the hinge rescrewed and a small piece of flat iron bent and fitted as a new latch plate. And the work was neat and considered and clearly done by someone who understood how things were supposed to fit together. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she put her provisions away and started supper. Over the meal she told him about the land office inquiry. She told it plain, without decoration, and watched his face while she talked. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention, nothing wasted. When she was finished he said, "This Dillard. He wants your land." "Yes. Because of what it borders. The creek draw runs through my south pasture. He controls everything east of it. My land is the piece he needs to control the water from the mountains all the way down to the valley. Without it, his cattle operation is manageable. With it, he runs this whole corner of the territory." Naish considered this. "And the law is made of the same material as the men who hold it," Clara said. "Some of it is sound and some of it has gone soft." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already understood to be true. That night he slept on the porch. She hadn't asked him to, she hadn't suggested it, but she woke at some point past midnight to the sound of the door opening quietly, and when she looked out, the pallet was moved to the porch boards and Naish was sitting against the wall with his knees up and his eyes toward the dark yard and the rifle she'd given him laid across his thighs. She went back to her bed and lay looking at the ceiling and thinking about the sound of Roy Pratt's boots on the general store's wooden floor. The sound came at perhaps 2 in the morning. It was barely a sound, a creak from the direction of the barn, and then silence. And then the particular disturbance of the horses that wasn't quite a full alarm but was a change in their breathing that any person who spent time around horses learned to hear. Clara was out of bed before she was fully awake, her feet finding the floor, her hand finding the shotgun leaned against the headboard. She heard Naish move on the porch. Heard him go still. She went to the east window, the one with the new latch, and eased it open a finger's width and looked out toward the barn. The moon was high and 3/4 full, throwing blue-white light across the yard, and after a moment she saw the shape of a man moving along the barn's south wall. Moving toward the barn door. Moving with the careful sideways progress of someone who is trying not to be seen and who is in the process of discovering that this is harder than it looked. A second shape appeared from the direction of the corral. 2 of them. The barn door was where she kept the winter hay. The barn door was where, if it caught, a fire would take the hay and then the structure and then potentially jump to the house in the right wind. And the wind tonight was out of the southwest and not negligible. She went out the back of the house in her bare feet and her nightgown and stood in the shadows at the corner of the porch. Naish was already crouched at the porch's far end, perfectly still, watching. She could hear the men now, low voices, too quiet to make words, and the particular sound of something being poured. Lamp oil. She smelled it on the air a moment later, faint but unmistakable. Clara raised the shotgun and fired it once, straight up, into the dark Arizona sky. The sound hit the night like a hammer. Both shapes by the barn froze. And then they ran, not toward her but away, back the way they'd come, crashing through the mesquite in the dark with all their careful stealth abandoned. Just men running from the sound of a shotgun the way men always run from the sound of a shotgun, which is fast and without dignity. She stood in the yard and listened to them go. After a while the sound faded. Naish appeared beside her. He was looking in the direction they'd gone, and his face in the moonlight was very quiet and very composed, but his eyes were the eyes of a man counting things, distances, directions, intentions. "Pratt," Clara said. Not a question. 2 men. Not skilled men. He paused. "They will try again." "I know." She looked at the barn. She walked to the south wall and crouched and found the damp ground where the oil had been poured, not much of it, and she got dirt and kicked it over and stood up again. Her feet were cold. The shotgun was heavy. "I will not leave until this is settled," Naish said. He said it without drama, without posturing. The same way he'd told her the oatmeal was needed. Simply, as the plain statement of a plain fact. Clara looked at him in the moonlight for a moment. "I know that too," she said. She went back inside and reloaded the shotgun and sat at the kitchen table with it across her knees until the sky began to lighten. And she drank 2 cups of coffee and thought about lawyers in Tucson and creek draws and the particular mechanics of how a person keeps what is theirs. She rode into Cobra Wells 2 days later with Naish on the horse beside her, which she had not done before. And which she knew would be a thing that the town would talk about until something more interesting came along to replace it. She rode in deliberately, in the middle of the main street, in the full light of mid-morning, because the alternative was to be circumspect and she had used up her circumspection entirely. She tied both horses in front of Beaumont's office and went in. Beaumont looked up from his desk and his expression did several things in quick succession before settling into something that was at least trying to be neutral. "Mrs. Voss. Someone tried to burn my barn 2 nights ago," she said. "Roy Pratt and one other. I didn't see the second man clearly, but I can describe him by height and the way he moved." Beaumont was very still. "You're sure it was Pratt?" "I am." "Can you prove it?" "Not yet," she said. "But I intend to." She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited. Naish remained standing by the door, and Beaumont looked at him once and then looked at Clara. "I need you to hear something," Clara said, "and I need you to hear it as the sheriff and not as a man standing in a current of other men's opinions." She put both hands flat on the desk. "Harlan Dillard wants my land. He has retained a Tucson lawyer to challenge my deed. He has, I believe, sent his men to burn me out when the legal route proved too slow. I want to know what protections the law affords me in this territory, and I want you to tell me directly, without the kind of careful vagueness that men in your position have sometimes found convenient." The office was quiet. Outside, the street sounds, a wagon, two voices arguing over something pleasant and ordinary, came in through the single window. Beaumont leaned back in his chair. He was a man capable of honesty when pressed into a corner by someone who wouldn't let him be otherwise, and Clara had always known this about him. "Your deed is sound," he said. "I looked into it myself after Dillard started making noise. Your husband filed it correctly in '79, and there's a territorial copy in Santa Fe that supersedes any claim Dillard's lawyer might construct. The irregularity he's claiming is in the county record, which he has influence over. But the territorial record is the one that stands in federal court. Then why hasn't anyone told me this?" A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. "Because I am telling you now," Beaumont said. Clara nodded slowly. "I need it in writing. An official letter. Today." Beaumont looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled open a desk drawer and got out a sheet of paper and uncapped his ink bottle. There was a man in town, she had already identified him, named Amos Ferris, who was not a lawyer by training but served as the town's land recorder and had studied enough law through correspondence to be useful. She found him at his home office above the hardware store and laid the situation before him with the same plainness she had used on Beaumont. Ferris was a small, exact man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers and the careful, precise attention of someone who has spent his life in the company of documents and finds them more reliable than people. He listened without interrupting. "There is a mechanism," he said when she was done, "that would make the deed challenge not merely difficult but legally impossible." He looked at his hands. "A homestead expansion and joint title filing. If you were to deed a portion of the property to a second party, a co-registrant, the combined filing would need to be challenged in federal court rather than county court, which takes Dillard's local influence entirely out of the equation." Clara was quiet for a moment. Who could serve as co-registrant? Ferris looked at her over his spectacles. "Anyone with legal standing in the territory." A pause. "There is also," he said carefully, "the matter of the formal homestead rights as they pertain to tribal land concessions made in the Treaty of 1872. I have read, Mrs. Voss, that certain provisions of that treaty, while largely unobserved in practice, do technically establish rights of residency and land use for Apache individuals in portions of this county. I would need to research the specifics." He was looking at her when he said this, and she was looking at him, and they were both thinking about the same thing. It took 4 days to arrange it. What happened in those 4 days was this: Amos Ferris rode to the county seat and pulled treaty documents and territorial filings. Clara Voss wrote a letter to the Federal Land Office in Santa Fe that Beaumont countersigned, which effectively froze the deed challenge in the county system pending federal review. And Naish, who had been listening to all of this with the focused silence of a man assembling a picture from pieces, told her one evening over supper something he had not told her before. "My grandfather signed the 1872 treaty," he said. "The land concession in this county was for a parcel that includes your south pasture." Clara set down her fork. "It was never honored," he said. "We did not expect it to be. But the signature exists. The document exists in Washington. Would your people support its being raised?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain, thinking. "If it served a purpose that was just," he said. "Yes." On the morning of the 5th day, a delegation arrived at Clara Voss's ranch. She had not been entirely certain what to expect. Naish had ridden out the previous afternoon and not returned until near midnight, and what he had said when he came back was simply, come morning, and she had nodded and gone to bed and slept soundly for the first time in 2 weeks. They came at sunrise, 7 Apache riders in the early light, the horses moving through the scrub with a quiet and effortless authority that made the land seem to open for them. They stopped at the fence line and Naish went out to meet them, and Clara watched from the porch with her coffee and her shotgun and no particular intention of using either. What came next was mostly beyond her understanding of language but not beyond her understanding of gesture and face. There was conversation she couldn't follow. There was the production of a roll document of some kind, old and careful, handled with the reverence you'd give to something that mattered. There was, and this was the part that went into her chest and stayed there, one of the riders reaching into a leather bag and producing something wrapped in trade cloth and holding it out. Naish brought it to her. He laid it in her hands on the porch and she unwrapped it. It was a belt of wampum, white and purple shell beads worked into a pattern of flowing water and the mountain above it. The craftsmanship so fine and so considered that she found she could not look at it without feeling something loosen in her throat. It is a recognition, Naish said. That you treated a man of our people as a man. That you spent your medicines and your sleep and your labor without being asked and without expecting return. He paused. Among my people, this is not a small thing. It isn't a small thing among mine either, Clara said. It's just that mine have gotten careless about saying so. The second rider came forward then and produced the document. It was the treaty parcel agreement, a hand copy made with care and attested with a seal, and with it came a willingness that Amos Ferris, when he saw it, called the most useful piece of paper he had handled in 20 years of territorial record-keeping. The joint land claim, filed simultaneously at the county, territorial, and federal levels, citing both the 1872 treaty provisions and Clara Voss's existing homestead deed, created a legal situation so complicated and so firmly anchored in multiple jurisdictions that Harlan Dillard's Tucson lawyer, upon reviewing it, sent his client a letter recommending withdrawal. Dillard rode out to the ranch personally 1 week later. He sat on his horse at the fence line and looked at the house and at the yard where Naish was working on the wagon axle and at Clara, who was standing on the porch with her arms crossed and her expression giving away nothing at all. He did not speak for a long moment. You made a complicated situation, he said finally. You made it complicated, she said. I just made it clear. He looked at Naish again. Then back at her. This ain't finished, he said. Yes it is, Clara said. Go home, Harlan. He turned his horse and rode. Beaumont came out 2 days after that, not on official business, he said, just riding past. He tied his horse and sat on the porch steps and drank coffee and looked out at the land in the way a man looks at something he is re-evaluating. After a while he said that Roy Pratt had left the county, packed up and gone, which was, in its way, a kind of confession. Dillard won't be quiet forever, Beaumont said. He doesn't have to be quiet, Clara said. He just has to be legal. And his options for being legal just got considerably smaller. Beaumont nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked at the Dragoon Mountains cutting their jagged line against the blue sky. You've got some allies, he said, that I don't think anybody planned for. I didn't plan for them either, Clara said. They came out of the mud in the rain at 4 in the morning and changed the plan entirely. And in the yard below the porch, Naish, who had heard this and had the kind of ears that missed very little, looked up from the axle work and met her eyes briefly, and said nothing. Which was the way people said the things that mattered most out here in the territory, in the silence between words, in the small steady acts of presence and repair. In the way you kept showing up to the work every morning regardless of what the night had brought. The territory does not care much for sentiment. It burns too hot and freezes too cold, and the ground it offers is rocky and grudging and asks everything of you in return for very little guarantee. But there is something that grows in that kind of country, something that the easier, softer places don't quite produce, and it grows in people the same way it grows in the land itself. Slow and deep-rooted, the kind of thing that survives because it has learned to survive, because it has been tested down to the bone and found that the bone holds. Clara Voss found a man dying in the mud and she carried him inside and she spent her medicines and her sleep on him without knowing what would come of it. She acted from the plain, unglamorous conviction that a breathing person in front of you is a breathing person in front of you, and that is sufficient reason to act. And the man she saved, when he was well enough, fixed her window latch and sat watch on her porch and brought her the weight of a history and a treaty and a people's recognition that made her small piece of Arizona not only legally sound but woven into something larger than herself. That is the nature of healing. It moves in both directions at once. You tend to the wound and the tending tends to you. You give shelter and the shelter becomes your own defense. The wampum belt hung on the wall inside the kitchen for the rest of her life. She was not a sentimental woman, but she kept it there where she could see it while she worked, the white and purple shells, the mountain, the flowing water, because it reminded her of the particular morning the territory had offered her a choice, and she had made the right one. Broken places can grow back stronger, but only if someone is willing to kneel down in the rain and mud and do the work of tending them. That is the whole of it. That is everything.